this film, I will take you back in time to London during World War II to show you what London was really like back then. I am of an age of not having been part of World War II, but I do remember many facts that my parents told me as a child in the late 1950s. This documentary is largely based on these memories. My father was in the Dutch Navy, stationed in London from 1943 onwards, after having been torpedoed twice, as shown in my films about the HMS Johan Maurits von Nassau and the HMS Isaac Sweers. At the beginning of the war, my mother was still a teenager. Later during the war, she worked as an office girl at Debenham Freebody, a large famous warehouse. She lived in London during the entire war until she married my father in 1945 and came to Holland at the end of that year.
You can do without chairs, fine Frigidaire, even the carpet that's laid on the stairs, the very roof up above. But you can't do without love. You can do without pots, couches and cots, swelligan roadsters, a beautiful yacht, a hat, a shoe or a glove. But you can't do without love. Love makes the world go round, makes a beggar a king. What's life unless you found that certain wonderful thing? You can do without frocks, watches and clocks, even suspenders to keep up your socks, the garden roller you shove. But you can't do without love. When old Father Adam took Eve as his madam, that girl was a bit of a rogue. She started a fashion that no one can ration. It's ever and ever in vogue. You can do without gates, saucers and plates, even the hob on your old kitchen grate, the chimney pot up above. But you can't do without love. You can do without spoons, penny balloons, bagpipes and organs, and even bassoons, a nightingale or a dove. But you can't do without love. Love makes the world go round, makes the beggar a king. What's life unless you found that certain wonderful thing? You can do without shirts, blouses and skirts, even the hose pipes, the gardener squirts, the carpet sweeper you shove. But you can't do without love. When the twilight is gone and no song a bird is singing.
My father loved to visit Lion's Corner House. I have a suspicion that he went there especially for the waitresses, nicknamed Nippies, with their short black skirts and white aprons.
Come into my heart, and here in my heart you will stay while I pray. My prayer with you at the end of the day, in a dream that's divine. My prayer is a rapture in blue, with the world far away, and your lips close to mine tonight.
for making this documentary is not only to share my parents' memories with you, but in particular also because I have noticed that the current young generation has hardly any idea what really went on in London during the war. After having read thousands of comments under my videos about old London, my conclusion is that most of us have now become totally out of touch with history. About 90% of the viewers are only able to see history through today's eyes and make comparisons and often totally misplaced judgments.
At the end of my prayer,
it can be concluded that this is the comments top 3. 1. When London was still white. 2. Everybody in this film is now dead. And 3. Not a fat, obese person in sight. This top 3 will be addressed in much more detail in this documentary. Metal fences and railings were removed from London's parks in order to be melted down to produce military objects. Entertainment in London's theatres continued during the war. Here we see a young Bill Odding, known from his role as Compo in Last of the Summer Wine, perform.
Does your stomach say, do you let it need? No need to be a clinging vine. You too can have a body like mine. Come on, everybody!
These are just some initial impressions of life in London during the war around 1942. What life was really like back then will be addressed in much greater detail later on in this film. Please do not be misled by these great images, which make it seem as if there is no war going on. Hopefully this video will provide a better understanding of having to live for 5 years under the constant terror inflicted by the German enemy. Barrage balloons are an interesting topic. These gas-filled balloons were tethered and intended to hinder enemy aircraft flying low over London and to make it far more difficult to perform accurate bombings. The balloons were raised with steel cables to an altitude of approximately 1500 meters. The Germans did succeed sometimes to shoot them down. In total about 1400 balloons were deployed, of which 500 over London. In view of the food shortages, the Dig for Victory campaign was set up by the British Ministry of Agriculture. Men and women across the country were encouraged to grow their own food in times of harsh rationing. Open spaces everywhere were transformed into allotments, from domestic gardens to public parks. Surprisingly, even the lawns outside the Tower of London were turned into vegetable patches. Also, window sills were used for this purpose. Many pigs were kept in back gardens.
Midnight with the stars and you.
The actively promoted scheme was to ensure that people had enough to eat and to keep morale high.
Your eyes held a message tender, saying I surrender all my love to you. Midnight.
In the spring of 1939, it became clear that war with Germany seemed unavoidable. Preparations were made, like planning for conscription of men and single women, the evacuation of children, barrage balloons and food supplies. On the day that war was declared, conscription became compulsory. All men between 18 and 41 were called up for active duty. Those under 51 were included for military service. Men under 60 were also obliged to do some form of national service. Women were recruited for the auxiliary units of the armed services. Harrowing scenes could be observed as parents said goodbye to their children on station platforms all over London and in other cities. Many of these children had the time of their life in these rural areas.
A million lovely sunbeams surround you all the time. Go take your fill, forget the bill. It doesn't cost a dime. Those little April showers.
After the initial war scare and many measures to further prepare the country for war, like the evacuation of the children, the erection of barrage balloons,
it doesn't cost a dime. That silver in the rippling stream,
the issue of gas masks to the population, and the drafting of young men for military service,
in the starlight, why they all belong.
and elderly men for the Home Guard, a relatively calm period started during which it seemed not much was happening on the war front, at least not in Britain. War activities were happening in Poland and some in France. The period was soon dubbed the Phony War and lasted nearly 8 months, from the beginning of September 1938 until the invasion by Germany of Belgium and the Netherlands on the 10th of May 1940.
It doesn't cost a dime.
During the Phony War, many parents decided to bring their children back to London. By January 1940, nearly half of them had returned, despite severe warnings by the government not to do so. Not long after the capitulation of the Low Countries, Hitler set his sights on England and started assaults by air as the first phase of his attempts to invade Britain. On the 18th of June, Churchill was the first to suggest that the Battle of Britain was about to commence. Britain officially recognizes the battle's duration as being from the 10th of July until the 31st of October 1940, which somewhat overlaps the subsequent Blitz period. It goes too far to explain the Battle of Britain in detail in this video. However, it can be summarized as the period during which the RAF and Navy Air Force The whole RAF operation was controlled from a secret deep underground bunker near Uxbridge. Frequently daily dogfights could be witnessed from the ground, involving RAF and Luftwaffe aircraft like the Messerschmitt and other types. By the end of October, Germany had in effect lost air supremacy and thus lost the Battle of Britain. Hitler decided to resort to other tactics, especially involving the consistent bombing of London. It should be noted that, according to some sources, London nearly was on its knees towards the end of this air battle. Vital infrastructure had been largely destroyed, and the police, fire and other rescue services were on their last legs. Some claim that London would not have been able. During the whole war period, the shops remained open, despite shortages, and bombed out display windows.
Speaking. Customers and staff will now take cover in the basement. Please do not run, but keep moving.
Down the stairs, or you can use the escalator.
After the bombings, some of the shops were more open. The war had a profound effect on nearly every aspect of daily life. During daytime, life went on almost as if there was nothing going on. But as soon as dusk fell, the Londoners started to prepare for the nightly German bombings. I remember my mother telling me that there were 3 options to get through the night. The first was to go to the nearest air raid shelter. The second was to spend the night on the platforms of the underground, and the third was simply to take one's chance and stay at home. My mother, her sisters and grandmother usually chose the latter. The shelters and the underground were deemed too cramped and smelly. Night after night she listened in bed to the sounds of falling bombs all around her, some in the distance but also frequently nearby. The only way to get through it was to take on an attitude of resignation to the situation and think, if it's my time to die, so be it. For 8 months, London was pounded night after night by German bombs in a campaign that the Germans called the Blitzkrieg, simply dubbed the Blitz by the London newspapers. In no way did Germany follow the rules of the Geneva Convention by only targeting military objects. Instead, the Blitz was a deliberate campaign to undermine British morale and force Britain into submission by bombing as many civilian targets as possible. The Blitz lasted from the 7th of December 1940 until the 11th of May 1941, so it was 8 months and 5 days. On the first day, called Black Saturday, 430 people died and 1,600 were injured. In the beginning of the Blitz, the Germans also conducted daytime air raids, but the Luftwaffe gradually decreased such operations in favor of night attacks to evade attacks by the RAF. The Blitz became a nighttime only bombing campaign after October 1940. Anti-aircraft missiles killed many people. Some historians say that maybe 50% of the casualties on the ground were caused by projectiles falling back to Earth. Women played an important role during wartime. Not only did they look after the children while the men were in active service in the Army, RAF, Royal Navy or Home Guard, but they also worked in munitions factories, as well as female air raid wardens, and in particular on the farmlands.
Wealthy and wise. Now I'm not very wealthy and I'm not very wise, but here's one thing that I realize.
Women pilots transported aircraft from the factories to the squadrons, served as ambulance drivers, seamstresses, worked in kitchens, performed air raid shelter duties, coast guard duties on land and sea, joined the women's voluntary services, worked in military factories and much more. The Women's Voluntary Service was an organization without ranks and without pay.
I'd mumble and grumble when night time was done. It's strange how I've changed now. I jump right up with the sun, for there's always a chance I'll meet you by dawn's early light. It's so easy to say good morning, but so hard to say good night. I'd mumble and grumble when nighttime was done. It's strange how I've changed now. I jump right up with the sun, for there's always a chance I'll meet you by dawn's early light. It's so easy to say good morning, but so hard to say good night. Early to bed, early to rise, makes you healthy, wealthy and wise. Now I'm not very wealthy and I'm not very wise, but here's one thing that I realize. It's so easy to say good morning to you. So easy to say good morning, 'cause look who I say it to. It's so easy to say good morning, a nice day in view, and oh how the rain clouds scatter when my day begins with you.
Many women worked for the Women's Land Army, WLA, established in 1917 to substitute the men who were drafted for war duties, thus causing a shortage in the farm's labor force. These women were often referred to as land girls. They picked crops and did all the jobs that the men had done before the war. Frequently land girls worked side by side with POWs, prisoners of war. One of my aunts was a land girl, and she told me that she flirted sometime with a handsome Italian POW.
I'd mumble and grumble when...
One of the most commonly made comments under my videos about Old London is the number 2 in my top 3, not a fat person to be seen, or similar words to that effect. Quite clearly the subject of obesity is at the front of the mind of many viewers as a result of witnessing hordes of overweight people in our modern society. What seems to be forgotten is that, unlike today, wartime was most certainly not a period of milk and honey. Food was not available in abundance, but instead needed to be rationed. Apart from a very small percentage of wealthy people, the overall majority of Brits barely had enough to eat to stay reasonably healthy.
Always a chance I'll meet you by dawn's early light. It's so easy to say good morning.
A coupon system was established, which gave people permission to buy food in exchange for money and coupons. Especially meat was rationed. There was also a lot of black market trade.
Time was done. It's strange.
My father once managed to get hold of some horse meat and treated my mother and grandmother to it. What he didn't realize was that eating horse meat was not done in a country like England with hordes of horse lovers. Fortunately, he only told them afterwards that it was horse meat, so they did get a good meal followed by quite some anxiety. Eggs were also difficult to obtain and often replaced by dried egg powder. As already not all lines were halted during the night. In the evening, special food trains would halt at many stations to deliver hot drinks and bread buns. The atmosphere in the underground in the evenings and during the night was something very special and remembered by all Londoners who lived through the war. Sadly, nearly all are now deceased and many memories have died with them. Not only making up a provisional bed on the platform and sleeping close to hundreds of other Londoners was an experience in itself, but also the entertainment that frequently took place in the evenings, like community singing, performing artists and musicians, and remarkable decorations at Christmas time. Even Christmas carols were sung. Trains would often still run in the evening, and many underground stations in London lie deep underground, only accessible via 2 or even 3 long escalators. However, some lines, like the Circle Line, that were constructed with the cut and cover method, are only just under street level. Some stations thus did not escape the bombings. On the 11th of January 1941 at Bank Station, a German bomb bounced down the stairs into the underground ticket hall and exploded, killing approximately 100 people. Unused tube tunnels also served as underground munitions and other war gear factories. The Plessy Defence Electronics Company built a secret factory in newly constructed underground tunnels at the eastern end of the Central Line. By March 1942, the 2.5-mile long factory was fully complete with flat floors, electrical switch rooms and air conditioning installed. The wartime factory had 2,000 staff, mostly women, working in shifts 24 hours a day.
Pardon me, miss. Am I going right for Piccadilly Circus?
Yes. Take a bus at the top and ask for the circus. You can't miss it.
Thank you very much.
Hold tight there, please. Hold tight.
For me personally, the London Underground played a very important role, because it was here where my parents met each other. My father travelled each day from his small flat at Bangor Hotel near Bayswater to the Dutch Navy's headquarters, who were stationed at the top floors of the CNA's warehouse at Marble Arch. My mother went to her work from Notting Hill Gate to Bond Street, so between Bayswater and Marble Arch was where they saw each other almost daily on the Central Line, and that's how it started. Since childhood, I have had an enormous fascination for the London Underground. I will never forget the sights, sounds and smells in the Underground during my childhood. like the clicking sounds of the contactors of the DC motors as the trains accelerated, the ear-deafening screeches of the trains braking at Notting Hill Gate Central Line station, the beautiful lamps aimed towards the tunnel ceilings, the distinct smell like scorched wood near the wooden escalators, and the crowds of office people still with umbrella and bowler hat on the platforms. Now over 50 years later, that feeling has still not subsided. As already mentioned earlier, gas masks were issued to the population at the beginning of the war in September 1939. In total, 38 million masks were distributed. The government was extremely scared that the Germans would use poisonous gas against the British population, including mustard gas, which was already used widely during World War I on the battlefields. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain went on the radio to explain the measures by the government and said,
"How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing."
This was another clear indication of his naivety, alongside his triumphant return from a visit to Berlin with a worthless letter signed by Hitler that he would never attack Britain. Clearly he was not fit for the job, and thus was succeeded by Winston Churchill.
That the final extinction of a baleful domination will pave the way to a broader solidarity of all the men in all the land.
People were encouraged to wear the masks for at least 15 minutes a day in order to get used to them.
It's important that we should be prepared against gas. Put it on for 10 to 15 minutes, one day a week. It may be a little irksome at first, but you'll soon get used to it.
Imagine how difficult it was to get kids to wear these masks that smelled after rubber and disinfectant and felt like you were being suffocated. The gas mask had to be carried at all times outdoors. They were normally kept in square cardboard boxes with a strap around the neck. Some say gas masks in the Second World War killed more people than they saved. Viewers of my World War II film about London during 1943 commented that nobody was carrying such masks. The reason is quite simple. By 1943 the gas scare was over. It then had become clear that Germany's ability to drop chemical weapons on Britain had declined, and that other weapons against Britain were in the making, like in particular the V1. The do's and don'ts were publicized in various forms, in particular with posters that were displayed in the streets, tube stations and trains. My mother used to talk about the coughs and sneezes spread diseases posters. Other posters warned against loose talk about secret topics. As of the 1st of September 1939, the Air Ministry imposed a blackout for the entire country. The aim was to make it as difficult as possible for enemy aircraft to navigate and find bombing targets. The blackout required that all windows and doors had to be covered at night with suitable materials such as heavy curtains, cardboard or paint to prevent the escape of any glimmer of light that might aid enemy aircraft. The measure created a lot of problems for factories, shops and homes. It also meant that all street lighting was switched off and traffic lights dimmed. Pedestrians needed to find their way in the dark using a not too bright torch. Homes were obliged to have buckets of water and sand ready to be able to immediately extinguish fires. ARP wardens made sure that the blackout was enforced, and thus would ensure that no buildings allowed the slightest peak or glow of light. Severe penalties were applicable if the blackout rules were violated. My mother recalled an ARP warden tapping on the window and shouting, "You're showing a light, Gov," just because a curtain had not been completely drawn shut. As a result of the blackout, not only night crime, like in particular burglaries, dramatically increased, but also caused a steep increase of traffic accidents, including many fatalities. In London alone, the number of fatalities averaged at a staggering 40 pedestrians per night, until the speed limit was further reduced. Plenty of Londoners frequently got lost on their way home from work.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
The blackout lasted until the last day of the war in 1945, with the Big Ben for the first time being lit in almost 6 years. A somewhat contradicting matter to the blackout was the use of many extremely bright searchlights that were continuously lighting the sky in search of enemy aircraft. Nearby aircraft defense guns were deployed to try to bring down such aircraft using the cross light of multiple searchlights. At the beginning of the Battle of Britain, Germany aimed its bombings on the Docklands, which implied that also the densely populated and impoverished east end of London was hit. After the bombings of the docks, Churchill and his wife came to inspect the damage. the Germans gradually extended the bombings to include other cities. Two types of bombs were used, high explosive and incendiary bombs. The first type caused the most personal fatalities, and the second type the most damage to buildings and infrastructure. These incendiary bombs were filled with phosphor, and thus sand was the best material to try to extinguish them, not water. One of my uncles frantically worked to put out a fire caused by an incendiary bomb that had fallen in my grandmother's backyard on top of the roof of Notting Hill Gate railway station behind Jameson Street. Up till the 1970s, the scorched wood of the station roof could still be seen from the platform of the Metropolitan line. In the night of the 10th to the 11th of May 1940, the Germans conducted their worst air raid ever, with 500 planes dropping 700 tons of bombs on London. A full moon helped them to identify their targets. My mother recalled seeing fires all around from her bedroom window. It was one of the scariest nights ever, and the damage and human loss of life was devastating. In that night alone, 1,500 people were killed and 11,000 homes destroyed. These images give some impression, but the real anguish is only something that can be experienced by those who lived through that 8-month ordeal. Praise should be given to the thousands of firemen, policemen and ambulance men who worked to the bone to extinguish fires and try to save lives. In the beginning of World War II, the Americans decided to remain neutral, but that changed with the bombing of Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. The first GIs landed on Britain's shores in 1942. The Americans occupied London later on during the war. And brought with them candy, Coca-Cola, cigarettes, chewing gum and nylon stockings, which made them very popular with the girls. Not only did they bring goods, but they also spent money, resulting in the British economy to go on the up. Women fell for the American culture, and many of them decided to marry a Yank, with the intention to move to the US after the war. By the way, the same thing happened in my country, the Netherlands, as well, but in our case it involved more Canadians than Americans. King George V and his wife played an important role during the war by in particular doing their utmost best to keep morale as high as possible. Frequently they visited bombed areas and spoke to the affected residents. Buckingham Palace also did not escape the bombings, as can be seen here. It is said that George VI's wife, Elizabeth, in view of sharing the war burden, was very pleased that Buckingham Palace got bombed too. Young Princess Elizabeth played a useful role as a mechanic in the army. However, probably the most important force behind keeping spirits high was Winston Churchill. He held strong, inspirational speeches on the radio. Most historians agree that he was the right strong man to lead the country through this extremely difficult period. After the Blitz, a period of less intensive bombing followed, which lasted for about 2 years. Adolf Hitler was occupied with other priorities, in particular concentrating on the Eastern Front with Russia. However, his quest to invade England had not subsided. Aerial reconnaissance flights by the RAF over Germany soon made clear that Hitler was planning a new onslaught, this time with the use of, for that time, extremely modern weapons. In May 1942, the Peenemünde facilities were discovered by a lone Spitfire. On the 13th of June 1944, the first V1 Vergeltungswaffe struck London. Most Londoners were terrified by the V1, nicknamed the Doodlebug or the Buzz Bomb. Its engine had a particular sound, and the most scariest moment was when the rocket engine would cut off, resulting in the V1 making a dive and causing a 1,000 kilogram payload to explode when hitting the ground. In the famous film The Glenn Miller Story, there is a scene where his band is playing in a London park while a V1 comes over. The audience tries to duck and cover to best ability, but the band keeps on playing. This was a fictitious event, but the strange thing is that this actually happened to my parents while watching a band playing in Hyde Park. The V1s were vigorously shelled by anti-aircraft guns in attempts to make them explode in mid-air above rural land before reaching London. RAF pilots tried to tip them over by giving them a nudge with their wings. After Peenemünde was heavily bombed by the Allies, the Germans moved their rocket program further inland to Nordhausen. Prisoners from the nearby concentration camp Dora Mittelbau were compelled to work there on the V2, Germany's first ballistic rocket missile, developed by Werner von Braun. Its factory was dug out in a mountain with tunnels extending for miles into it. Many V2s were fired on London from the Dutch and Belgian coast, from mobile rocket launchers. Contrary to the V1, there was not much that could be done to stop the V2, as it travelled at supersonic speed, and thus would hit its target totally unannounced. By the war's end, just under 30,000 Londoners had been killed by the bombing and over 50,000 seriously injured. Tens of thousands of buildings were destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of people were made homeless.
When your troubles are boiling over.
On the 8th of May 1945, the war was officially over. Hitler had committed suicide on the 30th of April 1945. and Berlin had been captured by the Allied forces and Russian Red Army. Huge crowds flocked to Buckingham Palace to see King George VI and his wife, the later Queen Mother, appear on the balcony. Apparently my mother and father were among these crowds, along with my grandmother. For years I have been looking closely at films of the crowds near the palace gates, where my parents said they had been standing, but so far, alas. That day went into history as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, involving huge street parties in London and other cities. To end this documentary, I would like to conclude that there is plenty to be discussed and reminisced as regards World War II in London. With most topics I have only scratched the surface. The internet is filled with historic websites. We hope this video is an inspiration for you to dig deeper into what actually happened in London during World War II, in order to get a much better understanding of what life was really like back then. Thanks for watching.
Window pane may show a world that is gray. Clouds drift away. For the world is always brighter when it's weathered a heavy storm, and our hearts are always lighter after teardrops have had to fall. Sunshine again will greet the world with a smile. Life seems worthwhile after the rain. Thunder and falling rain are driving us all insane, but when it's done, the sun will soon be shining again. After the rain, dry all your tears. Blue in the sky soon appears after the rain. Your window pane may show a world that is gray. Clouds drift away after the rain. For the world is always brighter when it's weathered a heavy storm, and our hearts are always lighter after teardrops have had to fall. Sunshine again will greet the world